Picture this. It's February 1847, and if you think your winter has been rough, let me tell you about Skeleton Pass. That's what the locals called it. And, brother, they weren't being poetic. This place earned its name the hard way, one frozen corpse at a time. 50 families, 207 souls, if you're counting like Sarah Henderson was. And trust me, she was counting every single person, because when you're trapped in 12 feet of snow with death knocking at your canvas door, every life matters. These weren't just numbers on a manifest. These were the Schmidts from Bavaria, still clinging to their last barrel of sauerkraut like it was liquid gold. The O'Malleys from County Cork, who had already started boiling their leather harnesses to make something that barely qualified as soup. And Moses Washington, a former slave who knew more about survival than most of these folks had forgotten, sharing his knowledge of pine needle tea, because scurvy was already turning children's gums black as coal. Now, how does a group of intelligent, reasonably prepared families end up in this frozen nightmare? They trusted a map, not just any map, Ezra Dutton's Shortcut to Paradise map. You want to talk about marketing genius mixed with criminal negligence? Dutton had convinced these people that his route would shave weeks off their journey to California. Instead, it led them straight into what I can only describe as a geographical bear trap. The Washoe guide, a man called Speaking Eagle, IC, had warned them. He'd looked at those February skies, felt the wind patterns, and told them what any sensible person familiar with these mountains would tell you. Early snow was coming, and it was going to be bad. But did they listen to the guy who'd been reading these mountains like a book his entire life? Of course not. They had a map, a beautiful, professionally drawn map that promised them everything they wanted to hear. This is one of those moments in history where you can see the disaster coming from miles away, but the people living it? They're looking at their hopes and dreams on paper, and reality just hasn't caught up yet. By February 23rd, reality had not only caught up, it had tackled them, sat on their chest, and was slowly squeezing the life out of them. Children were getting sick, adults were getting desperate. And desperation, my friends, makes people do extraordinary things. Sometimes extraordinarily stupid things, sometimes extraordinarily brilliant things, sometimes both at the same time. That's when Jedediah Carson rode into their camp. Now, let me paint you a picture of this man. 43 years old, which in 1847 mountain man years was practically ancient, ice hanging from his beard like nature's own wind chimes, and he's dragging behind him a sledge loaded with 800 pounds of rope. Not just any rope, we're talking hemp, horsehair, and rawhide, all twisted together using techniques the Arapaho had taught him. This wasn't Home Depot rope, folks. This was artisanal, handcrafted. My life depends on this rope. And his left hand, missing 2 fingers from what was already becoming a legendary fight with a grizzly bear, the locals had named Old Thunder. When Carson talked, and he talked a lot, he gestured with that damaged hand like it was some kind of badge of honor, which, in mountain man culture, it absolutely was. Carson looked at these dying families, looked at Devil's Throat Gorge that blocked their path to safety, and announced his plan. He was going to build a rope bridge, 180 feet across, 900 feet straight down to rocks that would turn a human body into jelly. The families looked at Carson like he'd just announced he was going to sprout wings and fly them all to California personally. But here's where it gets interesting. Carson wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart, though he wasn't heartless either. He'd been promised $5,000 by California merchants for any new route that could cut 3 weeks off the journey west. $5,000 in 1847 money, MOA. We're talking serious wealth here, enough to set a man up for life, if he lived long enough to spend it. Martha Hendricks, Trensis, and thank God for people like Martha who write things down. T recorded that night. The rope man speaks to his coils as if they were children, blessing each strand. He claims the gorge is only 180 feet across, but 900 feet deep. Most think him mad, but madness and genius dance close in desperate times. Think about that line for a second. Madness and genius dance close in desperate times. That's not just poetry, That's the entire human condition wrapped up in one sentence. The camp immediately split into 3 factions, and if you've ever been in any kind of crisis situation, you'll recognize these groups instantly. First, you had the believers, led by Moses Washington. Moses had seen enough of life to recognize when someone had that special combination of confidence and competence. He sensed something almost spiritual in Carson's certainty. Then you had the skeptics, rallying around banker Theodore Whitman. Whitman demanded that Carson work without any promise of payment. Whitman, basically asking the man to risk his life for free on the off chance he might succeed. It's the kind of logic that makes perfect sense when you're not the one hanging over a 900-foot drop. And finally, you had the largest group, the desperate middle ground. These were parents watching their children get sicker by the day, people who would try absolutely anything if it meant a chance at survival. Carson, showing the kind of shrewd business sense that had kept him alive in the wilderness for decades, laid out his terms. $10 per adult, $5 per child, payable after successful crossing. But here's the genius part. The families who crossed first would pay half price. Now stop and think about what this did to the group dynamic. Suddenly, everyone had to decide. Was going first being a guinea pig, or was it getting a privileged position? Were you brave or stupid to trust this madman's ropes with your family's lives? Were you brave or stupid not to? As February bled into March and another blizzard dumped more snow on their failing shelters, 22 children were now burning with mountain fever. Time wasn't just running out, it was sprinting toward the finish line, and these families were stumbling behind, weighted down by snow, cold, and the terrible arithmetic of survival. Carson had his ropes, he had his plan, and he had 207 people whose lives depended on whether madness and genius were really dancing together or whether madness was just dancing alone. The question hanging in that frozen air wasn't whether Carson could build his impossible bridge. The question was whether anyone would be alive long enough to cross it. March first dawned with the kind of cold that makes you question whether God has a sense of humor or just hates humanity. 15 degrees below zero by the thermometer, and that's if you were lucky enough to have a thermometer that hadn't already cracked from the cold. This was the kind of bitter that froze spit before it hit the ground, the kind that made your breath come out in clouds so thick you could practically carve your name in them. And this was the day Jedediah Carson decided to climb Devil's Throat. Picture this man, if you will, 120 pounds of rope coiled across his shoulders like some kind of hemp python, iron spikes clanking at his belt with every step, sounding for all the world like death bells announcing his arrival. He looked up at that eastern wall, 2,000 wall, nearly vertical rock face stretching up into the morning sky, and started climbing like it was just another Tuesday. Speaking Eagle, the Washoe guide who had tried to warn the families about the early snow, watched from below. He later told Martha Hendricks something that gives me chills every time I think about it. Carson climbed like the spider goddess herself taught him. Each movement deliberate, each spike placed where the rock welcomed it. Where the rock welcomed it. Think about that phrase. This wasn't just technical climbing. This was a conversation between man and mountain, and somehow Carson was fluent in both languages. Now, let's talk about the physics of what Carson was attempting, because the numbers here are absolutely staggering. He needed to string an initial guide rope across 180 feet of empty space, not 179 feet, not 181 feet. Exactly 180 feet of howling wind and certain death. And this rope had to be anchored well enough to withstand 500 pounds of lateral force. 500 pounds. That's not just the weight of a person crossing, that's accounting for wind load, dynamic stress, and the fact that when people are scared out of their minds hanging over a 900-foot drop, they tend to move in ways that put extra strain on everything. Carson's solution was pure genius wrapped in desperation. He took a modified Arapaho bridge design, too. And remember, these were people who had been building bridges in impossible places for generations and strengthened it with double-braided hemp and tar-sealed joints. The tar wasn't just for waterproofing. In those temperatures, it was the difference between rope that stayed flexible and rope that snapped like a frozen stick. At 60 feet up the cliff face, disaster nearly struck. A rock shelf that looked solid as Gibraltar just crumbled. Carson found himself dangling by his safety line, spinning slowly over the abyss while chunks of stone thundered into the void below. 12 seconds. That's how long he hung there, and if you've ever been in a truly life-threatening situation, you know that. 12 seconds can feel like 12 hours. The people watching from below. And remember, these were families with children who were depending on this man's success for their very survival. They watched their last hope swing helplessly against the cliff face. Some of the women were crying, the men were cursing. And Carson? Carson was calculating. By noon, he'd reached the narrowest point of the gorge, a ledge, exactly 4 inches wide where the walls came closest together. 4 inches. I want you to stand up right now and look at something 4 inches wide. Maybe the spine of a thick book. Now imagine standing on that, 900 feet above jagged rocks, with gusting wind trying to peel you off like bark from a tree. This is where Carson performed what might be the most audacious feat in the history of American frontier engineering. He had crafted a massive U-bow specifically for this moment. Not some sporting goods store special, but a piece of functional art that could launch an arrow with enough force to cross that gap. Attached to this arrow was a spider silk thin pilot line, the thread that would eventually become the lifeline for 207 souls. It took 17 attempts. 17 times, Carson drew that bow, aimed into the gusting wind, and watched his arrow either fall short or get blown off course. The crowd below went from hopeful to anxious to nearly desperate as arrow after arrow disappeared into the gorge. On the 18th shot, 88th, and I want you to imagine the pressure this man was under, the arrow found its mark, lodging firmly in the opposite cliff face. The watching crowd erupted. People were cheering, crying, praising God and Carson in roughly equal measure. But Carson knew something they didn't. That arrow was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. For the next 3 days, Carson lived in what can only be described as an exhaustion-fueled fever dream. He crossed and recrossed that pilot line like some kind of rope-walking madman, each journey adding new cables, new anchors, new safety features. And here's where his genius really showed. This wasn't just about getting across. This was about building something that could handle the weight and panic of terrified families. His innovations were remarkable. Tar-sealed knots that wouldn't freeze solid in the mountain cold. Leather-wrapped handholds spaced exactly 18 inches apart, the perfect distance for human hands under stress. And perhaps most impressively, a revolutionary pulley system that multiplied human pulling power by 4. Remember, they didn't have cranes or winches. Everything had to be hauled across by human muscle, and Carson had figured out how to make that muscle 4 times more effective. But not everyone wanted Carson to succeed. On the second night, a rival guide named Jacob Thornton led a group of men to cut Carson's ropes. These weren't desperate families. These were competitors who saw Carson's success as a threat to their own business. The frontier was like that sometimes. Salvation for some meant financial ruin for others. That's when Moses Washington stepped up. This former slave organized the first rope militia in American history, armed guards who stood watch over Carson's bridge night and day. Think about the irony here. A man who had been considered property was now protecting the property that would save everyone's lives. March 4th brought the moment of truth. ITS. The first test crossing. Carson, showing the kind of psychological insight that marked all his decisions, chose 12-year-old Patrick O'Malley, light enough to minimize strain on the system, brave enough to volunteer, and young enough to follow instructions without overthinking the danger. As Patrick inched across, suspended in a leather harness that Carson had sewn with his own hands, 200 people held their breath. Halfway across, a wind gust set the boy swinging like a pendulum. Women screamed. Men prayed. And Patrick, following Carson's instructions to sing loud and look at clouds, reached the far side in 14 minutes. 14 minutes that changed everything. The age of the rope bridge had begun. The Great Crossing began March 5th under skies that looked like they were planning something unpleasant. And let me tell you something about Jedediah Carson. 2012. The man was a strategic genius, masquerading as a mountain madman. That crossing order? Supposedly determined by lottery. But Carson had rigged that lottery like a Mississippi riverboat gambler. First to cross was the Hendricks family, Martha, her husband John, and their twin daughters. Now, Carson had been watching these people for days, and he'd noticed something crucial about the Hendricks. They were calm under pressure, strong marriage, steady nerves, the kind of people who would set the right tone for what was about to become the most terrifying parade in American history. He was absolutely right. Martha sang hymns the entire way across. Not quietly, mind you. We're talking full-voiced, echo off the canyon walls, singing that transformed this death-defying crossing into something that sounded almost joyful. Her voice bounced between those rock walls like an angel's chorus. And suddenly, what had seemed impossible started feeling inevitable. But every crossing after that became its own individual drama, its own life-or-death story that would be told around campfires for generations. Take Wilhelm Schmidt, the German brewmaster. This man weighed 240 pounds, soaking wet, and in his winter gear he was pushing closer to 300. Carson had to specially reinforce the harness and add extra safety lines because the standard setup simply wouldn't hold him. Wilhelm made it across, but that bridge was groaning and swaying like a ship in a storm the entire time. The man's knuckles were white as fresh snow by the time he reached the other side. Then there was pregnant Mary Washington, A.A., Moses's wife, who decided the baby wasn't going to wait for a more convenient time. She was having contractions while crossing, gripping those leather handholds with one hand and her belly with the other. 2 hours after reaching safety, she gave birth to Hope Washington, who became known as the first rope baby, a tradition that would somehow continue for generations as families named children after this crossing. 4-year-old Jenny Chen presented a different kind of challenge entirely. Her parents were Chinese railroad workers, and Jenny had inherited that particular brand of fearlessness that comes from watching your father blast through mountains with dynamite. Halfway across, the little girl fell asleep, dangling 900 feet above certain death, and she decides it's nap time. Carson had to inch out onto the bridge and carry her the final 60 feet while she slept peacefully in his arms. The technical challenges multiplied with every family. Crosswind speeds reached 30 miles per hour, tan enough to set the bridge swaying 6 feet in either direction. Ice kept forming on the ropes, requiring constant scraping that Carson performed while suspended over the void. He developed a numbered flag system to communicate across the gorge, creating what was essentially the first aerial traffic control system in the American West. But the real crisis came after the 40th crossing. The main rope, the one everything else depended on, started fraying. Not just surface wear, but deep structural damage that meant total failure was imminent. Carson performed emergency repairs while hanging over that 900-foot drop, weaving new strands into old. With fingers so cold, he later said they burned like hellfire. Picture this. You're suspended by a backup line, working on the very rope your life depends on, knowing that 200 people are counting on you to not fall into the abyss. And your fingers are so cold they feel like they're on fire. That's the kind of pressure that breaks most people. Carson just kept weaving. By March 7th, 170 people had crossed, but Mother Nature was preparing her final challenge. The weather was deteriorating fast, and the final 30 souls, explode, including Theodore Whitman's stubborn faction who had delayed crossing, hoping for rescue that never came, faced the worst conditions yet. That's when Jacob Thornton arrived with 20 men. Remember Thornton, the rival guide who'd tried to cut Carson's ropes? Well, he was back, and this time he wasn't being subtle about it. He demanded half of Carson's fees for protection. Protection from what? From him and his men, obviously. It was extortion, plain and simple, disguised as frontier justice. The situation nearly turned violent. You had exhausted, desperate families on one side, armed men demanding money on the other, and Carson in the middle trying to keep everyone alive. This was about to become a shooting. a war over a rope bridge, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that people kill each other over much less when survival is on the line. But sometimes solutions come from the most unexpected places. 12-year-old Patrick O'Malley, 12, the same boy who'd made that first terrifying test crossing, stepped forward and made a suggestion that was pure diplomatic genius. Why didn't Thornton's men earn their share by helping haul the heavy wagon supplies across? A 12-year-old boy just solved a crisis that had grown men reaching for their guns. Thornton's men got to save face. Carson kept his fees, and everyone focused on the real priority, getting those last families to safety. The final crossing belonged to Carson himself, bringing across the last child, an orphaned Paiute girl named Morning Star, whom the camp had adopted. They were exactly at the midpoint when Carson felt it, that subtle change in rope tension that his experienced hands recognized immediately. The anchor spike on the western cliff was pulling free. Carson didn't hesitate. He sprinted the final 90 feet with Morning Star clutched to his chest, diving onto solid ground just as the entire bridge system collapsed into Devil's Throat with a sound like the world ending. They had made it. All 207 souls stood safe on the western side, watching their salvation disappear into the gorge below. Carson's impossible rope bridge was gone, but it had done its job. Sometimes that's all you can ask of the impossible, bar that it work long enough to save the people who need saving. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos wrapped in celebration. Picture it. 207 people who had literally just cheated death, standing on solid ground for the first time in weeks, watching the twisted remains of their salvation disappear into Devil's Throat. Some were laughing, some were crying, most were doing both. These families had lost everything except the most important thing, Manafixam plays, in lives. But here's what's remarkable about the human spirit. Within days, they were already planning their future. Word of the miracle at Devil's Throat spread to Sacramento faster than wildfire in dry grass. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. "Mountain Madman Saves Hundreds," screamed one headline. "The Rope Bridge to Salvation," proclaimed another. Carson, being Carson, was deeply uncomfortable with all this fame. The man who had just performed one of the most audacious rescues in American history wanted nothing more than to disappear back into his mountains. But not before he collected his fees, approximately $800 that he immediately invested in something that would change the American West forever, a permanent rope bridge company. Now, those 50 families had been bonded by something stronger than blood, shared trauma and triumph. They established a town called New Carson along the American River, and the culture that developed there was unlike anything else in America. Think about it. You had German brewing techniques mixing with Irish storytelling traditions, Chinese agricultural wisdom blending with African American spirituals. It was like someone had taken the entire immigrant experience and compressed it into one community. The annual Crossing Festival, which began in 1848, became legendary throughout California. They recreated the event with rope dancers performing death-defying acts above safety nets. Children played Carson and the Gorge, with every kid in town arguing over who got to be the rope man. It was part historical reenactment, part circus, and part religious ceremony all rolled into one. But Carson's real revolution was just beginning. His rope system didn't just save those families. It transformed Western travel entirely. Within 2 years, Carson's company had built 17 rope bridges throughout the Sierra Nevada, cutting journey times by weeks and saving countless lives. Every bridge used his innovations, those tar-sealed knots, the leather-wrapped handholds, the pulley systems that multiplied human strength. Carson established a training school in 1849 that taught what became known as the Carson Method. This wasn't just engineering, it was philosophy. Students learned that rope-making was sacred work because each strand represented a life that might depend on it. The school's motto, "Strength through Unity," reflected Carson's core belief that individual fibers became mighty cables only when they worked together. The California legislature, recognizing what Carson had accomplished, granted him $15,000 and 1,000 acres in 1850. $15,000, IMA. That's serious money in any era. But in 1850 California, it was enough to make a man wealthy for life. But here's what tells you everything you need to know about Jedediah Carson's character. He gave most of it away. He funded schools that taught practical engineering to frontier children. He established the Morning Star Orphanage, named after that last little girl he'd carried across the bridge. He paid for Speaking Eagle's grandson to attend university back east. When railroad magnates offered him $50,000 for his bridge locations in 1855, Carson accepted on one condition: they had to employ his rope school graduates as construction supervisors. Think about that for a moment. The Transcontinental Railroad, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, was built partly by men trained in Carson's rope school. Those cables supporting railroad bridges across impossible gorges, they used braiding patterns Carson had developed. The man who started with hemp and horsehair ended up influencing steel and steam. Carson lived until 1873, spending his final years in a cabin overlooking Devil's Throat, where his rope bridge had hung for those few crucial days. Local children reported seeing him sitting at the cliff's edge, holding what appeared to be conversations with the wind. Maybe he was talking to the mountain. Maybe he was remembering all those voices he'd guided to safety. Maybe he was just an old man enjoying the view. His funeral drew over 3,000 people, including 43 members of the original 50 families. As his body was lowered by ropes into a grave overlooking the gorge, his MLA, because of course they used ropes. Patrick O'Malley spoke for everyone present. Patrick was now a successful bridge engineer himself, having learned his trade in Carson's school. He said, "Carson taught us that the impossible is just the possible, waiting for someone crazy enough to try. Today, if you drive Interstate 80 through the Sierra Nevada, you'll cross near Devil's Throat on a massive concrete span that can handle 18-wheelers doing 70 miles per hour. But look carefully at the engineering, and you'll see Carson's legacy everywhere. Those steel cables providing additional support, they used the same braiding pattern he developed with hemp and horsehair. The visitor center displays fragments of his original ropes, preserved like religious relics. Every March 5th, descendants of those 50 families gather to remember the day 207 souls trusted their lives to rope, wind, and one man's beautiful madness. They tell stories about pregnant Mary Washington and little Jenny Chen who fell asleep mid-crossing. They remember Wilhelm Schmidt's white knuckles and Martha Hendricks's hymns echoing off canyon walls. But mostly, they remember that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when desperation meets determination, when madness dances with genius, and when one person refuses to accept that some problems simply can't be solved. Jedediah Carson proved that with enough rope, enough courage, and enough crazy determination, you can bridge any gap, even one that drops 900 feet in hell itself.